The blade was already out before I understood what I was seeing. One moment, Kale Voran was standing by his desk, his crest flushed dark with shame, and the next moment, there was a thin, curved edge in his hand, catching the light from the high windows. The whole room went silent in a way that felt physical, like the air itself had frozen. I remember thinking, very clearly, that I did not know what to do with my own body. My hands would not move. My legs would not move. I simply sat there, staring, while my hearts pounded so hard I could feel them in my throat. My name is Dennis Okoro, though most people at the academy just call me Denny, and until that morning, I thought I understood the difference between danger and the idea of danger. I was wrong. I was about to learn the difference the hard way, sitting 3 rows back from the front of a classroom that smelled like chalk dust and fear. Let me back up, just for a moment, so you understand how we got here. Ash Grove Academy sits on a neutral station between 5 different systems, built specifically so that young people from different worlds could sit in the same rooms and learn the same lessons, without their governments arguing about whose gravity was correct. It was supposed to be a place of peace, a showcase, proof that all of us, no matter where we came from, could learn together. Most of the students were like me, calm, careful, raised on worlds where disagreements were settled with words, where the worst thing that happened to you on a bad day was a strict teacher or a missed meal. We did not know what real danger looked like. We had only heard stories. And then there was Mara. Mara Whitfield sat in the back corner of every class, always in the same seat, always with the same quiet, unreadable expression. She was human, one of only 4 humans in the entire academy, and humans were still new enough to most of us that we did not quite know what to make of them. There were rumors, of course. There are always rumors about the ones who seem too calm, too careful, too aware of every exit in a room. They called her homeworld a death world. I did not understand what that meant, not really, not until that morning. I thought it was just a word people used to sound clever, the way you might call a strict teacher a tyrant without meaning it literally. I thought humans were dramatic about their own history, the way every species is dramatic about its own history. I was wrong about that too. Mara never spoke much. She answered questions when asked, always correctly, always briefly, and then she would look back down at her notes as if the conversation had never happened. She was polite. She held doors. She helped other students pick up dropped books. If you had asked me, the day before, whether Mara Whitfield could be dangerous, I would have laughed and asked whether you had ever actually spoken to her. That morning, we were in a class called Comparative Ethics, taught by an older instructor named Professor Daniel Yeaths, a soft-spoken teacher who wore long gray robes and rarely raised his voice. We were discussing conflict resolution across different cultures, a fairly ordinary topic, the kind of thing that fills up a Tuesday morning without anyone expecting trouble. Kale Voran sat near the front. He came from a world where status mattered more than almost anything else, where standing in a room was measured constantly, silently, by everyone around you. He was not a bad person, not really, just proud, in the way that young people from proud cultures often are, and that morning, the professor had corrected him twice in front of the whole class. The first correction was small. Kale had misquoted a historical treaty, and Professor Yeaths gently pointed it out. Kale's crest flushed slightly, but he nodded and moved on. The second correction came from Mara. She rarely spoke up in class, so when her voice cut through the room, quiet and steady, everyone turned to look. She was not trying to embarrass him. I want to be clear about that, because I have thought about this moment many times since, and I do not believe she meant any harm. She simply said that the treaty Kale was describing had actually been broken within a year of signing, and that the historical outcome he was using to support his argument was not accurate. She was right. Professor Yeaths even nodded and thanked her for the correction. But something changed in Kale's face. His crest went from flushed pink to a deep, angry red, the color his species turns when their pride has been wounded in front of others. On his world, being corrected once by a teacher was survivable. Being corrected twice, the second time by a fellow student, in front of the entire class, was something else entirely. It was a mark against his standing, and standing, on his world, was not something you could afford to lose. He did not say anything right away. He simply sat very still, his hands pressed flat against his desk, his breathing slow and controlled in a way that looked deliberate rather than calm. I noticed it. A few others noticed it too. But Professor Eaths had already moved on to the next topic, and the lesson continued as if nothing had happened. For almost 10 minutes, nothing did happen. We took notes. Someone asked a question about mediation techniques used on a water-scarce world, 3 systems away. The professor answered thoughtfully, drawing a diagram on the board. It was, in every way, an ordinary class. And then Kale stood up. He did it slowly, the chair scraping back with a long, low sound that made everyone look up. He was not looking at the professor. He was looking at Mara. I do not know exactly what he said first, because my ears were ringing with something I did not yet recognize as fear. But I remember the tone of it, low, tight, the kind of voice that comes out when someone has been holding something in for too long, and it finally breaks free. He said something about respect, about standing, about how she had no right to speak to him that way in front of others, especially not a creature from a world that barely understood civilization. Mara did not respond right away. She simply watched him, her expression calm, almost curious, the way you might watch weather rolling in from a distance. That seemed to make him angrier. His hand moved to his belt, and the blade came free so fast that I did not even register the motion until it was already in his hand, catching the light, and the whole room seemed to inhale at once and forget how to breathe out again. I want to explain something about the blade, because it matters for what happened next. On Kale's world, that kind of blade was mostly ceremonial. Status weapons were carried by many people there, symbols more than tools, rarely drawn and almost never used. I think, if I am honest, that even Kale did not fully intend to use it. I think he wanted to frighten her. I think he wanted, more than anything, to reclaim some small piece of the standing he felt he had lost. He took one step toward her. That was when everything I thought I understood, about calm, quiet Mara Whitfield, fell apart and rebuilt itself into something else entirely. She did not scream. She did not freeze the way I had frozen, the way half the room had frozen. Chairs pushed back, breath caught somewhere between the throat and the chest. She rose from her seat in one smooth motion, unhurried, almost lazy, as if she had simply remembered she needed to stretch her legs. I have replayed what happened next in my mind more times than I can count, trying to slow it down, trying to understand the mechanics of it, and I still cannot fully explain how fast it was. One moment Kale was stepping toward her with the blade raised. The next moment his arm was turned at an angle that should not have been possible, his fingers open, the blade no longer in his hand but resting flat on Mara's open palm, and his knees were bending, folding him down toward the floor, as though gravity itself had decided to side with her. She had not thrown a punch. She had not shouted a single word. There was no violence in it the way I had imagined violence. No wild swinging or desperate struggle. It looked, more than anything, like a dance move that only one of the dancers knew the steps to. Kale made a small sound of shock, more surprise than pain, and went still, held in a position that made further movement clearly impossible without hurting himself. Mara stood over him, unbothered, breathing exactly as steadily as she had been breathing 5 seconds earlier, before any of this began. The whole thing had taken less time than it takes to say it out loud. For a long moment, nobody in the room moved. Professor Eaths stood frozen by the board, chalk still in his hand, mouth slightly open. I realized I had been holding my breath and let it out slowly, afraid that even that small sound might shatter whatever fragile stillness had settled over the room. Mara looked down at Kale, and her expression was not angry. That surprised me more than anything else that had happened so far. I had expected fury, or at least the cold satisfaction of someone who has just proven a point. Instead, there was something almost gentle in her face, something close to sympathy. She set the blade down on the nearest desk, carefully, handle first, the way you might set down something fragile rather than something dangerous. Then she crouched slightly, so she was closer to his eye level, and she smiled. It was not a cruel smile. I want to be very clear about that, because if I only describe her actions, you might imagine someone cold or cruel, someone who enjoyed what had just happened. That was not what I saw. Her smile was almost sad, almost kind. The kind of smile you might give a child who has just touched something hot and needs to understand, gently but firmly, why that was a mistake. "That's not how a real blade gets used," she said, quietly enough that I had to lean forward to hear her. "Where I'm from, if you pull one out, you use it or you don't pull it out at all. There's no in-between. No warning strike, no showing off." She paused, and her voice softened even further. "You're lucky you're not from my world. Where I grew up, this moment would have ended very differently, and neither of us would be having a calm conversation about it afterward." Cale stared up at her, his crest gone pale now, all the anger drained out of him, and replaced with something that looked a great deal like fear. "I wasn't going to," he started to say, his voice cracking slightly. "I know," Mara said, and released his arm gently, stepping back to give him room to sit up. "That's the only reason you're still sitting here talking, instead of lying on the floor wondering what happened. I could tell you weren't going to use it. That's the only reason I didn't hurt you." The way she said it was not a boast. It was simply a fact, delivered the way you might explain the weather, and somehow that made it more unsettling than if she had shouted it in triumph. She was not proud of what she had done. She was simply telling the truth, plainly, because she believed the truth mattered more than comfort. Professor Yeats finally found his voice. He set down the chalk with trembling hands, and asked Cale if he was hurt, then asked Mara, in a much more careful tone, whether she needed to speak with the academy counselors. Mara shook her head and said she was fine, that it had really been nothing, and then she picked up her notebook from her desk and sat back down, as if she had simply stepped away to answer a question in the hallway. That was, somehow, the strangest part of the entire morning. Not the speed of what she had done, not the calm in her voice, but the fact that afterward she simply returned to her seat and continued taking notes, as though nothing at all had happened. Cale was taken to speak with the academy administrators. I heard later that he was not expelled, that instead there would be some kind of mediation between his family and the school, some process meant to help him understand what had gone wrong inside him that morning. I do not know all the details. What I do know is that he never looked at Mara the same way again. Whenever he passed her in the hallways after that, he would nod, quickly, almost nervously, and hurry along, as though even eye contact might invite something he did not want to face again. For the rest of that day, nobody in the class could focus. Professor Eves tried to continue the lesson, tried to return to his diagram about mediation techniques, but his voice kept trailing off, his eyes drifting toward the desk where the blade had briefly rested, before being taken away by school security. I found myself staring at Mara throughout the rest of the class, not out of fear, though there was some of that too, but out of something closer to fascination. She sat exactly as she always had, back straight, notebook open, pen moving steadily across the page as she copied down the professor's diagram. If you had walked into the room without knowing what happened, you would never have guessed that 10 minutes earlier she had disarmed an armed classmate in less time than it takes to blink twice. At lunch, I finally worked up the courage to sit near her. Most of the other students kept their distance, not out of dislike, I think, but out of a kind of nervous awe, the way you might keep your distance from something powerful, even when you know it means you no harm. I sat down across from her with my tray, and for a while neither of us said anything. Finally, I asked the question that had been sitting in my chest since that morning. "How did you do that?" She looked up from her food, and for the first time that day, she seemed almost embarrassed, glancing briefly at the other tables before answering. "Where I grew up," she said slowly, choosing her words carefully. "You learn things early, not because anyone wants you to, because you have to. My homeworld isn't like most of the places people here come from. We don't have gentle weather, or predictable seasons, or animals that leave you alone if you leave them alone. Everything on my world can hurt you, if you're not paying attention. The weather can kill you. The wildlife can kill you. Even some of the plants can kill you, if you're careless enough to eat the wrong berry." She paused, turning her fork slowly in her hand, not really eating, just thinking. "So you learn to pay attention, all the time. Not because you're brave, and not because you like fighting, but because the alternative is that you don't get to grow up at all. My grandmother taught me how to handle a blade before she taught me how to properly write my own name. That's just how it works where I'm from. It's not something to be proud of, It's just survival. I sat there, turning her words over in my mind, trying to imagine a childhood like that. A world where every single day demanded the kind of alertness I had never once needed in my entire life. Where I came from, the worst thing you might encounter on a walk home was rain. But you didn't hurt him, I said. You could have. Everyone could see that. But you didn't. Mara looked at me for a long moment, and something in her expression shifted, softened even further. That's the whole point, she said. Knowing how to hurt someone and choosing not to, that's not weakness. That's the entire lesson. Anyone can lash out when they're scared or angry. It takes something else to stay calm enough to choose what happens next, instead of letting fear make the choice for you. Kale was scared and embarrassed, and he made a mistake because of it. I wasn't going to make it worse by matching his mistake with one of my own. I did not have a response to that. I simply sat there, letting the words settle over me, understanding for the first time what people meant when they used the word Deathworld, not as a dramatic label, but as a description of an entire life shaped by constant, quiet awareness. It was not about being violent. It was about being ready, always, and choosing, again and again, not to be. Word of what happened spread through the academy quickly, the way these things always do, growing slightly with each retelling, until by the end of the week, there were students swearing they had seen Mara disarm 3 classmates at once, or that she had broken Kale's arm, or a dozen other exaggerations that bore only a passing resemblance to what had actually happened. Mara never corrected any of it. She simply kept to herself, attended her classes, answered questions when asked, and continued exactly as she always had before that morning. But something had changed, quietly, in the way the rest of us looked at her, and in the way we looked at humans in general. Before that day, most of us had thought of the human students the way you might think of a quiet neighbor, pleasant enough, a little strange, not particularly remarkable. After that day, we understood something we had not understood before. Not that humans were dangerous exactly, though some students certainly walked away with that impression. What I understood, sitting there at that lunch table, listening to Mara describe a childhood shaped by constant danger, was something quieter and, I think, more important. Humans were not frightening because they were savage. They were frightening, and remarkable, because they had learned to carry enormous capability with enormous restraint. Every single day, students like Mara walked through our halls, holding the ability to end a conflict in half a second, and every single day, they chose instead to sit quietly through lessons on ethics and mediation, taking notes, answering questions politely, holding doors open for strangers. That, I came to understand, was the real lesson of that morning, not the speed of her movements, though I still think about that sometimes, still wonder how anyone could move that fast without seeming to try. The real lesson was in what came after. In the gentle way she set the blade down instead of using it, in the sadness in her smile as she looked down at Kale, in the plain, quiet way she explained herself to me at lunch, without pride, without drama, simply stating facts about a life very different from my own. Professor Eaths never fully returned to his usual calm after that day. I noticed, in the weeks that followed, that he was slightly more careful in how he corrected students, slightly more aware of pride and standing, and the invisible weight some students carried into every classroom. Perhaps that was its own kind of lesson, one that had nothing to do with blades or speed, but with the quiet damage that embarrassment can do to a person who has nowhere safe to put it. As for Kale, I saw him a few months later, sitting with Mara during a study session before an exam. They did not seem like friends, exactly, not in any close sense, but there was an ease between them that surprised me the first time I saw it. He asked her a question about the material, and she answered patiently, without any trace of the tension that had once filled the room between them. Whatever process the school had put him through, whatever conversations had happened behind closed doors, something in him had softened, and something in her had, I think, forgiven him the moment it happened. I think about that morning often, even now, years later. I think about how close everything came to going terribly wrong, and how one person's calm, built from a childhood I still cannot fully imagine, kept it from happening. I think about the difference between danger and the idea of danger, and how easy it is to confuse the two until you have actually stood in a room where both were present at once. Mostly, though, I think about her smile. Not triumphant, not cruel, just quiet, and a little sad, and entirely certain of what she was doing and why. It taught the whole room something that no lesson plan ever could have, something about restraint and readiness, and the strange, quiet strength of a person who has learned to carry danger without ever needing to use it. That was the day I stopped being afraid of what I did not understand about humans, and started, instead, to respect it.